Welcome to another episode of the ONPHA Opening Doors podcast. My name is Marlene Coffey. I'm the CEO of the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, and I'll be your host today. In the last episode, we talked about the newly launched Low End of Market Rental Housing Monitor, also known as LEMR. This new data tool offers insights into evolving landscapes of the affordable rental housing across Canada. The data can be used to shed light on key trends impacting housing affordability. It equips decision makers with the best information to make data-driven housing decisions. And ONPHA is a proud partner in this project. It speaks to our strategic commitment to advance innovation and improve access to data within our sector. In today's episode, we're diving deeper into the practical applications of the LEMR Housing Monitor, using examples from Ontario and British Columbia. We'll take a closer look at how we can leverage this data to identify areas primed for investment and ultimately expand housing opportunities on the ground. Joining us as we navigate the intersection of data and action, as we continue to strive for affordable housing for all, we now have two special guests that I would like to welcome. Joining us today, we have Stéphane Giguère, CEO, Ottawa Community Housing. OCH is a $3.5 billion portfolio, the largest social housing provider in Ottawa, and a leading organization in our sector, as well as a member of ONPHA. Joining us is also Katie Maslechko, CEO, Rental Protection Fund. She is an award-winning real estate professional with experience in building strategic partnerships across the private sector, nonprofit, and government sectors to deliver community building projects. Welcome both. We are so pleased to have you here as our guests. Let's start the conversation with our friends in BC. Katie, you oversee the new Rental Protection Fund in British Columbia, which aims to allow affordable housing organizations to purchase buildings and offer units at below market rents while protecting renters over the long term. Tell us about how the Rental Protection Fund is being used to target affordability at the neighborhood level.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we are actually coming up this month about a year since we officially kind of started operations. So the Rental Protection Fund here in BC was established with an initial investment from our province of $500 million. With, as you mentioned, the purpose of utilizing that to help nonprofits, co-ops, Indigenous-led housing providers in BC acquire existing rental buildings across the province, move them into the community housing sector, and keep them affordable in perpetuity, and capturing them, before they reach that point of disinvestment or being beyond repair, so that we can reinvest in them, extend their useful life, make them more sustainable for those nonprofits to operate, and keep them around for much, much longer. So we've been at it ever since. And over the past year, we set up our application process, intaking applications to first pre-qualify our applicants. And then once they are pre-qualified through our process, they're then allowed to bring forward individual acquisition applications of sites that they find are the right fit for them. And we both work with them throughout that process to ensure that it is the right fit and it does meet our criteria, and then bring it forward for consideration by our investment advisory committee and myself. In fact, after I get off this call, I've got our 5th or 6th investment advisory committee meeting to review some really exciting new acquisitions coming forward this month. So we are tracking well at this point. We're about 900 units deep in terms of those that we've approved, and absolutely just blown away with the demand that we've seen. We've got about 100 applications underway or already pre-qualified from nonprofits, and about 2,000 units already in the pipeline, of which about 900 we've approved funding for. So it's been blowing us away, the demand we're seeing, and it was great to see. You talk about the data-driven approach too, because that's very core to how we're tackling this as well. And I've got a pretty incredible team who has done some pretty magical work already in just a short period of time in terms of not only how we, analyze and communicate our own investment decisions and impact, but also in creating tools for the entire sector to be able to make that much more strategic acquisitions of their own, and really giving them back sovereignty over their own data, and empowering them to utilize that to the fullest extent.
You have such an amazing story, and congratulations. I don't want to just skip over that because what you described to us is incredible, and congratulations to you and the team.
Thank you.
I do, though, I am very, very curious about the seedling of a concept before you got to the place that you're currently at. So how did this come to be as enough of an idea where you and the larger team mobilized to put something together? There must have been some research or some understanding of the marketplace to really direct you.
Well, I think a lot of the credit there goes to my amazing board members, who are Jill Atke of the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Tom Armstrong of the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, and Margaret Foe of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, who together as kind of the Housing Central Coalition, they've been really pushing for this type of fund or this type of investment from the province for many, many, many years. And it's just my great privilege to be able to help that vision be realized. But they were the ones really who have crafted this vision and advocated for such a long time to make it possible. And it really is kind of built upon a few different things, but that for anyone acquiring existing rental buildings, there's inherently an equity gap that exists, and it's going to look the same regardless of whether it's a nonprofit acquiring it or a private owner. Aside from the fact that maybe the nonprofit can access some special lower cost financing. And that equity gap can really only overcome one of two ways. It can be overcome by having access to a fund like this, where we can provide contributions to help bridge that equity gap that allow the rents to stay in place. Or in the traditional sense, where that building gets acquired and the only way to overcome that gap is by increasing the rents, either immediately or over time. And that's what puts the affordability of those units in jeopardy. And so it's really built on that kind of fundamental tenet at its core. But we also see it too in the sense of, we are very fortunate that the investment from the province was provided in a way that it could act as a capital contribution. It didn't need to exclusively be a loan-based program. And we really see that as a long-term investment in the community housing sector, and making sure that as we transfer those funds in, we're able to secure them to ensure that we can make sure they're maintaining the building and following the affordability standards we've developed together, but that ultimately we want that capital contribution to also be able to act in a really meaningful and powerful way on their balance sheet so that they can leverage against it and expand their services, grow their capacity in a way that really the sector across the country, but certainly in BC, has always been challenged to do, because they may operate hundreds of units, but when many of them are so encumbered by, housing agreements and other things like that, it makes it really, really challenging to actually utilize those assets as leverage and grow against them. And that you can grow against them without necessarily needing to displace those tenants. And so we really see that too as an investment in the sector and building them into much bigger and more well-funded players in the supply side of the equation as well. I know we are all about preservation, but the long-term view is that this leverage allows them to be even bigger actors in the supply equation too.
Right. So what you're describing to us, the audience here, is really understanding the marketplace and how affordability bridges the low end of market and below market, and how we as the community housing sector can play a role in ensuring that we're building out that continuum.
And that's
So
exactly what it is. It's that gap in the continuum that so many of the other
Yep,
programs aren't able to fill.
correct. I agree totally. So how are you using the fund to target affordability at the neighborhood level? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think with preservation, that happens in a number of ways. In large part, it's a really powerful way to be able to maintain community, even while the community is also changing and evolving and diversifying, but keeping those most at risk, in place in their homes where they've built their lives for the last, 20 or 30 years, where they've built those communities, either literally or figuratively, and alleviating them of that risk of housing insecurity, and that they would have really nowhere else to go. These are the people who they make a little bit too much to actually qualify for most of the subsidized housing programs, but they're a long ways away from being able to afford, market rent. And that's what this allows it to do. And also making sure that we capture those buildings in place while they're still able to be repaired and renewed, because disinvestment is a very real threat these days, with interest rates being where they are and inflation being what it is. Even the most well-meaning landlords are kind of being stretched to their limits, and some of these buildings can fall into disrepair, and this is a really critical moment to be able to kind of catch them as they're falling, and be able to reinvest in them, and in doing so reinvest in the community.
Katie, you're very much early days in a very ambitious plan to ensure affordability in your province. Can you share with us some of your success stories, how that is playing out and resulting as the initiative?
Absolutely. I think two things come to mind there. One being that the province right now of BC is, of course, doing a lot to invest in housing and reshape legislation, and so are the municipalities, quite frankly. And preservation as a housing tool is a really important and strategic way for all those levels of government to kind of maximize the investments they're already making. Because if they're investing all this money and resources into building new supply, but they're losing 4 to 5 units for every one new unit that they're building, that's not a great ratio to begin with. And it's not really maximizing that significant investment that so many of them are making. And so it's a really critical time, I think, for them to have launched the fund alongside everything that they are doing. And so that everyone gets to benefit too from the investments in community, not just those who may be arriving new to it once the housing is being built, and ensuring that we're holding on to what we have while we're also building new. I think in terms of some of the success stories, it's been really wonderful, especially for the team and I, who have been working away at this for the better part of a year, and we get to know the buildings and the nonprofits, really, really well. But to finally be able to have some of these buildings closed, to be able to show up and celebrate with them and have an announcement, and get to talk to the tenants whose lives are just being transformed in many ways by being not transformed, if that makes sense, that stability is just a huge transformative experience for them. They've kind of been living in threat of displacement for some extended period of time. And many of them, there's one that closed a couple of months ago where they had their tenant kind of welcome meeting at the building before they closed. And there was a lineup 12 people deep of people who insisted on talking to the CEO of that nonprofit to be able to share their stories of what this meant to them and how significant it was. And in particular, there was one gentleman who had lived in the building, I think 32 years. He was 75 years old. He thought he was 2 years away from retirement until the building went up for sale. And then he was terrified that he was either never going to retire or that he very well could end up homeless. And I think that that's a very scary but very real reality. This is a homelessness prevention tool in a lot of ways. And so there's just been so many incredibly powerful stories like that we're so proud to be able to impact.
So everything you just described is about strategic growth. It's a growth mandate, which is incredible that we're able to be talking about this as the community housing sector. And so I'm really interested to hear from you, what else is needed? If you were to look ahead 5 or 10 years, what could we be doing now to magnify that strategic growth?
Well, I do think we're starting from the right point in terms of genuinely investing in the community housing sector and finding ways like acquisitions to grow it faster, because we are lagging way behind our peers globally in terms of the percentage of our housing supply that is community housing sector owned. And that this certainly is a big step in the right direction, that combined with the sector being able to also deliver new supply is going to put us on the right track. We've just got a long ways to go, but I think it's setting us up for great success in that way. And I can only hope that across the country, there will be the demand that we've seen here in BC, and I have the sense that there will be.
Stéphane, we're talking about some real life examples here, and at Ottawa Community Housing, we know that you recently, your organization that is, recently partnered with Minto Apartments, being a REIT, real estate investment trust, on the sale of 2 Ottawa properties that allowed OCH to expand its portfolio and keep existing tenants in their homes. It was a shining example of the impact of strategic partnerships, and I would really like to hear more from you about that milestone in your community.
No, a very important question, and thank you for it, Martin. When you look at Ottawa Community Housing, if we take a step back over the years, we were used and we're still used to be building. In fact, that is part of our growth strategy. We did a little bit of acquisition, and that was really sporadic here and there over the years, land acquisition, buildings. But what came to mind with that Minto deal was really about, something that has changed in the marketplace, which is about protecting affordability for the residents. And in that acquisition, we talk about 311 homes, townhouses, and we knew that if it was to be flipped into a transaction in the private sector, that it will in turn be something where the rent structure will change radically because of renovation, because of the repairs, or simply because of the change of ownership. And again, it was important for us to stay below the average market rents for the residents over there. And also from a pure financial standpoint for Ottawa Community Housing, what we were looking into this was also the cost structure element. When you acquire, you talk about, like in that case, $270,000 per door. We know that building new is also very expensive, but it's important. So we need to continue to build. But the cost of building right now in Ottawa is averaging $550,000. So now you can imagine there's a little bit of a saving there. And at the same time, also, it does allow to build capacity for the future, meaning that we will have natural, turnovers that will be happening, offering opportunities for new residents to be moving in. So we try to look at it from a holistic point of view, and that's really the approach that we've been taking.
What are the other benefits outside of what you've just described?
we look at doing an acquisition, the first benefit is really clearly for the residents. For most of the residents, they were at 60, 70, and 80% of the average market rent. So now you can appreciate that in any sort of transaction, those rents will have been subject to speculation and clearly could have increased to points where it would have become really unaffordable. In the Ottawa market, we've been subject to a transaction that has created a lot of noise across the province and across Canada with Timber Creek, where residents were evicted. And we were really trying to protect the residents first and foremost. The second benefit, it's really about also the inheritance of a stock that was properly maintained. Minto was really investing in capital repair property, doing the proper maintenance. And interestingly, also, when we look at the demographic, and this is maybe a third element to consider, the demographic that we see now in social housing and at Ottawa Community Housing are very similar to the demographics that Minto was serving. New Canadians or kind of low-income type of families living there, but also the one that they have been long-standing tenants. We know that in the private sector, long-standing tenancy is something that can go against profitability. When you look at a transaction like this one, in terms of the tenancy that we have there, it's important to recognize that long-standing tenancy is important for the private sector, but also could be an impediment towards profitability because you need also new tenants to generate new income. That's in a pure market, environment. In a nonprofit sector, for us, it's important to maintain the level of affordability that those longstanding tenants have benefited over the years, because we understand that flipping the properties, selling a property and moving to another owner could expose those rents to incrementals that will make the situation for those families totally unaffordable. And again, what we were looking at in those transactions was to avoid for the residents to have to make choices between food or rents.
So you've spoken a little bit about the benefit to a people-centered approach, as well as the stability and growth plans for your own organization. We know that in Ontario, we very much are focusing on a supply mandate in order to address the housing crisis. Mm-hmm. Do you, Stéphane, see a connection here in terms of how we're working with stakeholders in the marketplace to help address the supply challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where ONPHA and Ottawa Community Housing has a lot in common, because we are building on the same pillars of building, preserving, and supporting the residents. And interestingly, when you complete a transaction like the Minto one, which is a transaction of $86 million, there's a lot of due diligence, financial requirements, financial ratios. The management of Ottawa Community Housing was assessed throughout the entire transaction, from looking at the financial ratios that the banks were looking for, and they were looking into the capacity for this organization to undertake even more. And so when you look at building and growing a portfolio, you have to look at the different tools, the different offerings in the market. And also you have to be agile, because you need to also start turning to the opportunities that they are coming your ways. And there are many other opportunities for acquisition for the entire sector. And it can be very small acquisition. You can protect a duplex as much as you can protect a high-rise building, or a community of townhouses, as we did. But it is important to recognize that each and every time that we are not protecting affordability, it's falling back into the speculation of the private market. And that's the element that right now is important that we look at, because the supply element will take time to fill. No matter what, in construction, from the day that you have a good idea to say, I want to build, the house of my dream, or I want to build a community of the dream of the residents in a nonprofit, co-op, or municipally owned type of environment, it takes anywhere between 2 to 5 years, depending on the size of the project. From the conceptualization to the blueprints, the planning, the approval, and then the building, and then having a turnkey solution in your end, that's the cycle. So in between, this is where acquisition fits, because in between you can protect the residents, and with the notion also that they could be eventually eligible to move to those type of new homes that you're building. And right now the market needs to move from that gridlock ready to something that is more adapted and agile. And agility will come by having many tools in our tool set. And again, acquisition, growth, building are part of the tool set itself.
What a wonderful story and example to lead in terms of how we can change lives and build community. And we often in Ontario look to British Columbia as an example of being leaders in the sector. And so I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how other providers or other organizations could learn from you and your experiences. What advice could you give our audience?
Absolutely. Well, I think I would give some advice to any provinces or other levels of government considering investing in preservation. Is one of the most powerful things that BC did, and credit to them for recognizing it, is putting this in the hands of the community housing sector. You know, the people who are closest to the work, who know it best, and who, you know, collectively we were able to deliver it at quite a rapid pace, and with more demand than anyone expected. And I really do think that is critical. You know, acquisitions just in general operate at a different pace and a different process than new development does, and so programs need to reflect that accordingly. And I think credit to also to the Housing Central crew of ONPHA, CHF, and BC NPHA, because I think that collective voice was really, really powerful in making this possible in the first place, and that preservation can impact all of those, you know, segments of the sector in a really meaningful way. So from kind of two perspectives, I think that would be my advice.
It's such an exciting time, and your organization and you specifically are a fantastic example of leadership in Canada as well as in Ontario. And so, Stéphane, I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the lessons you've learned or experiences that you've had that can be some great advice for others who are looking to take on similar initiatives.
Very good question. And when you look at doing an acquisition of that size and of any size, it's very important that you look at and you self-assess your capacity. You have to be realistic about what you can undertake, and you have to be realistic about how the organization can really absorb and grow in the future with that type of acquisition, because this is not kind of the end for any organization to say, okay, we will be acquiring and then that's it. No, acquiring means that then after that you need to maintain, you need to operate, you need to serve those new residents that they are joining you. They have some set of expectations from previous landlords that you need to maintain, but in fact improve by moving into your portfolio. The other aspect is really tied to the due diligence. They are very complex transactions, involving lawyers, accountants, engineers, and professionals in building assessment, land assessment. And when we look at the transaction on our side, it took about 3 to 4 months to complete. But I can tell you it was all hands on deck. Let's go, let's do it, let's just build the capacity. And again, we knew that in our cycle, also it was perfect fit, because back to earlier what I mentioned about construction cycle, which takes longer, this is where acquisition can fill those gaps in the meantime. The last piece that is important around an acquisition is also our financial capacity. the last thing that any organization will want is really to start choking your financials because you did an acquisition. So because everyone will be impacted, from your residents to your staff to your stakeholders. So in community building, it's important also that we look at more and more partnership in the sector. There are organizations that they have the financial strengths that they can support and help others. And as well, you have also local capacity building that has been established in townships and cities and municipalities that can also piggyback on that experience. So it's important that we all work together, that we build those type of capacities and we share that type of capacities across the sector.
Good advice. I'm sure there's been some challenges along the way. Have there been anything that was unexpected that you could share with us in terms of forming those partnerships? How were they addressed? What kind of challenges have you encountered?
Yeah, I would say definitely the number one kind of challenge has been the fact that there is no existing, well, up until as of Thursday, that hopefully comes to, fruition relatively quickly, the federal announcement there, but that there is no dedicated program for acquisitions, not from a lending perspective necessarily, not from a CMHC perspective. A lot of really great programs at CMHC, but they're not suited for acquisitions, which is a little bit of its own, nut. And that's certainly presented some challenges, both in terms of pace and timing and sequencing. We have been fortunate to have some very patient vendors who really, really want to be able to sell into the community housing sector, but they're not going to be patient forever. And having to wait 8 to 9 months for, CMHC approvals just doesn't really line up with that. And certainly makes it quite challenging for us and for the nonprofit. So that's been a challenge. I'm very hopeful that last week's announcement has everything headed in the right direction, not only for BC, but certainly for the whole country, because I think that this is such an important tool, but it needs its own dedicated solution, whatever that looks like and wherever it lands.
This is a great segue into our second theme for this podcast, which is about the recent announcement on the Canadian Rental Protection Fund. Really great news that we've seen over the last week or so with the $1.5 billion commitment to that Canadian Rental Protection Fund. What's your take on the significance of the fund for providers here in Ontario?
When you look at the new announcement around the rental acquisition fund, one thing comes to mind is equity. Our sector is short in equity, and we all know that. And it's very important that we see investment that will really trigger leverage and allow the ability for providers, no matter where they are and the size that they are, to have access to equity to start being able to build that capacity and that pipeline of acquisition. Because acquisitions should be short-term, medium-term, and long-term acquisition targets. When you look at, what is called in the private sector merge and an acquisition is exactly something where you have to make sure that all of the processes are followed around due diligence and making sure that it fits and suit, your organization and the client that you're serving. But also it's important that we realize that by having that type of investment, that commitment from the different level of governments towards acquisition and affordability, it is sure that at the end, the residents of Ontario will have now a new solutions for them to protect them and to protect affordability.
Mm-hmm. Over to you, Katie.
We're thrilled to see it. I think, as I said, a dedicated program is much needed, and this is a huge step in the right direction. I think in a lot of ways, the devil's in the details, and that understanding what the debt in particular will look like is going to be really, really important, because that has a direct effect on kind of the outcomes that can be achieved, both in terms of number of units across the country, the breadth of affordability, let's say, and other kind of key metrics when it comes to this. But I am really pleased that they did step up with such a significant grant portion, because that's really critical too. You can have some great, very attractive debt, but the real magic here is having that investment in the community housing sector, giving them equity that's then accruing and multiplying, and then can be redeployed, to purchase another building down the line, or to position them to independently redevelop a different property in their portfolio. So I'm really, really pleased to see that, and that it's also started to spark other provinces to step up and make commitments of their own or evolve their existing programs in other ways. To see Manitoba step up as part of the announcement, that was great to see. I know Toronto just increased the size of their Mura program. So I do hope that that commitment last week starts to incentivize others to do the same, and that having debt like that is predictable to some extent is also going to be really important in terms of attracting other sources of capital. There's a lot of private capital that has a genuine interest in supporting acquisitions and acting in the affordable housing space. But just like anyone, they need predictability, and we need to be able to guarantee that their expectations can be met. And so that level of predictability is a challenge we've had in terms of a lack of that predictability, lender to lender or deal to deal. So really looking forward, even just for our pipeline, but certainly for work across the country in this space, and what that will mean in terms of catalyzing private investment into the sector.
So everything you just described is about strategic growth. It's a growth mandate, which is incredible that we're able to be talking about this as the community housing sector. And so I'm really interested to hear from you, what else is needed? If you were to look ahead 5 or 10 years, what could we be doing now to magnify that strategic growth?
Well, I do think we're starting from the right point in terms of genuinely investing in the community housing sector and finding ways like acquisitions to grow it faster, because we are lagging way behind our peers globally in terms of the percentage of our housing supply that is community housing sector owned. And that this certainly is a big step in the right direction, that combined with the sector being able to also deliver new supply is going to put us on the right track. We've just got a long ways to go, but I think it's setting us up for great success in that way. And I can only hope that across the country there will be the demand that we've seen here in BC, and I have the sense that there will be.
When you look at the sector and the growth, I want to take a step back here about also the change in demographics. It's important that we adapt really well as nonprofits to the one that we serve. If you look about 20, 30 years ago, immigration was, defined in specific groups. 30 years ago, we're talking about Italian communities, Asian communities, now more and more Arabic communities, African communities. Also, we have seen also a change in family compositions in new immigrations that we're seeing, and the trends that we're seeing around immigration. So it's important that we look also at the type of build and acquisition targets that we will have in the future, because you need to be there to serve the needs of those communities, that they are enriching Ontario, that they are enriching Canada. So when we look at the growth strategy for us, it's really the capacity to adapt. The second fold is really about the aging population. A lot of us are just aging naturally, but it's important to recognize that now in social housing, in affordable housing, the population will live longer and stay longer amongst us. And they will be part of those acquisitions as well. They were maybe not the seniors when they join that landlord that you acquire the building, or they are maybe not the seniors today living amongst your communities, but all of a sudden 10, 15, 20 years later, they are the seniors living there. and they don't have an expectation to move for different set of reasons. They have an expectation to grow and to be contributors to their community. And that's very important that as owners, as landlords, and as community builders, that we offer them also, I would say, just a social return on all the investment that they gave to us over the years and how we can protect that in the future. So part of the growth strategy for Ottawa Community Housing is really turning the lens towards where is the future of our tenancy, what would be their needs, and how we will adapt the portfolio, our buildings, our properties, our communities to the needs of the residents.
I'm moving into the closing question now for our audience and for you, Stéphane, which is something that we talk about on our podcast, which is the theme of opening doors for people to thrive through affordable housing in their community. And so a shout out to you. We'd love to hear what door you are most interested in opening.
For Ottawa Community Housing, the doors that we look at opening are really the ability for different sectors to be working with us and us working all together with the other sectors. And when I mention sectors, I mean education, health, justice, all of those sectors that they are very strong contributors to our residents, our tenants. The tenants that we name tenants are in fact students in the school, but they are the tenants that we house. They are the patient in the healthcare system, that they are the residents that we house. So that's the same person at the end. So how can we shift that systematic view around tenancy and making sure that everyone is contributing to really successful tenancy for the residents of Ottawa Community Housing, but the broader sector. And in fact, for us right now, we have opened a door with healthcare providers. We're working in collaboration with Ottawa Public Health, with the Ministry of Health on complex care and healthy at home. And two solutions that, and they have something in common, is to bring care to the door. And again, if we could do that, if we could start shifting, and we've seen amazing example with Blue Door in North York, and we have seen other examples in Quebec or in BC, where as soon as you start delivering care services at the door, you alleviate a lot of social pressure in the communities and you see better outcomes for the residents. So those are just small examples that, looking at really bringing forward, an open door type of policy will be kind of changing and will be a big game changer for the residents, but for the systems as well.
That's great. I'm interested in your thoughts, Katie.
Well, I think it's that security and housing stability is far more transformative than it appears at face value. And that when you can be alleviated of that constant stress and anxiety and uncertainty that can, either just plague your mind endlessly or makes it, that much more challenging to just build your life, build your wealth, because you never quite know when you may have to move, or if you can afford to move, or if you can even find somewhere to move to. And that once alleviated of that really terrifying, destabilizing state of being, it's not just a feeling. I think it's often a state of being. And that then you have the capacity to start looking into the future, to start building wealth and expanding your community and multiplying all of those things. And preservation and acquisition is such a powerful way of doing that. And so it's one of the really, really beautiful things about the work we get to do.
I'd like to encourage everyone listening to explore the Lemur Housing Monitor and especially the data stories for a deeper understanding. To view the Lemur Housing Monitor, visit lemr.ca. Once again, we thank the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for your housing supply challenge and for supporting this project. And so as we move into close, I really do want to summarize what we heard from each of you, our guest speakers. Stéphane, you talked about building capacity for the future. You talked about moving from the gridlock and using the supply angle through a stakeholder and partner approach. You also shared with us some thoughts around health, justice, and education, and how a systemic view can help us work together. Katie, you talked to us and brought your experience about working with the province and how the role of capital can really help us in solving problems. You talked about leveraging the balance sheet without having to displace tenants. And you used the term grow it faster. And that is a fabulous term that we will reference often. You both talked about growth and a growth mindset and how partnerships and strategic activities help us achieve our shared goals. So thank you again for your insights and for your time and being with us today. We're going to be exploring a lot of topics we touched on today with more depth at our annual conference, which is taking place in Ottawa this year from November 7 to 9. If you're listening to this podcast, this event is probably right up your alley. The ONPHA conference is the biggest learning and networking opportunity of the year for all people interested in affordable housing, so don't miss it. Tickets are on sale now, and you can learn more and register online at onpha.conference.on.ca. Thank you again for listening. See you next time. This podcast was recorded before the federal government's announcement at the end of April 2024, which released the new Canada Housing Plan and Rental Protection Fund.